skies this morning may not look like it, may not make you think of rainbows. But we're going to open today with some words of wisdom from Kermit the Frog. Why are there so many songs about rainbows, and what's on the other side? Rainbows are visions, but only illusions. Rainbows have nothing to hide. So we've been told, and some choose to believe it. I know they're wrong, wait and see. Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. Who said that every wish could be heard and answered when wished on the morning star? Somebody thought of that, and someone believed it. Look what it's done so far. What's so amazing that keeps us stargazing? What do we think we might see? Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. All of us under its spell. We know that it's probably magic. Have you been half asleep? And have you heard voices? I've heard it calling my name. Is this the sweet sound that called the young sailors? The voice might be one and the same. I've heard it too many times to ignore it. It's something that I'm supposed to be. Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. La da da dee da da dum, da 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 dum.
Our opening words about this month's theme of grace are from Frederick Buechner, a Presbyterian minister and author. After centuries of handling and mishandling, most religious words have become so shop-worn, nobody's much interested anymore. Not so with grace, for some reason. Mysteriously, even derivatives like gracious and graceful still have some of the bloom left. Grace is something you can never get but only be given. There's no way to earn it or deserve it or bring it about any more than you can deserve the taste of raspberries and cream or earn good looks or bring about your own birth. A good sleep is grace, and so are good dreams. Most tears are grace. The smell of rain is grace. Somebody loving you is grace. Loving somebody is grace. At this time, I invite you to rise in body or spirit and join me in our opening hymn, number 55, Dark of Winter.
Well, it's great to see you guys this morning. I have a story I want to share with you, but first I want to ask a couple of questions. Have you ever suddenly had a good idea but didn't know quite where it came from? Like just something popped into your head and you were like, oh, wow, I wonder how I thought of that. That ever happened to you? Did it ever happen to some of you guys? Yeah, this is not just for children, you know. This is a time for all ages. And how about if you're having a conversation with somebody else and they help you figure something out? They know something you don't, and then when you put your ideas together, you come up with something even better. Have you ever had that happen? Well, This is a story from the Ashanti people in West Africa, and it's about a spider. The spider's name is Anansi, and Anansi is in lots of stories from this part of the world. He's kind of a trickster character. If you've ever heard any stories about Coyote in Native American tales, Spider is kind of like Coyote. He's a little bit of a trickster. He doesn't always make really good choices. And in this story, Anansi the spider had all the wisdom in the world stored in one big pot. All of the wisdom in the whole world. Now, if you had a pot full of all of the wisdom in the world, what would you want to know? Like, what would you look for in there? What do you wish you knew? Something you wish you knew how to do? Can you think of anything? Like, if I had all the wisdom, grown-ups, if you had all the wisdom in the world in one big pot, how to get along with everyone. Wouldn't that be a great one? I can think of some people I'd like to give that bit of wisdom to. I can think of whole collections of them right now, in fact. Anybody else? Will the Eagles win? I'm not sure that counts as actual. That's prognostication, Jim. That's a little different. We'll get to that next time. Well, Anansi kept looking in this pot every day, and he learned all kinds of things. Now, he lived in the jungle in West Africa, so he was looking to learn things like how to make things out of the fiber in the leaves of the trees, how to build houses, and how to get along with his family and his neighbors. He learned all kinds of things. Now, the sun god who gave him this pot said he was supposed to share the wisdom with everybody. Do you think he did? No. He was really greedy. He said, I am keeping this all to myself, and then I will know everything. So he decided to hide this pot full of wisdom, and he decided the safest place to hide it would be at the top of the tallest tree in the jungle. So he began to climb, holding a great big pot full of wisdom. Now, of course, spiders have 8 legs, so that helped a little. He only had to use 2 to hold the pot. But even so, it made climbing up very awkward. His son, whose name was Intakuma, was on the ground watching. And after he watched for a while, he said, Dad, you would be able to climb with that pot a lot more easily if you tied the pot to your back and had all your legs free for climbing. Well, Anansi realized that that was a really clever suggestion. But instead of appreciating it, he got really angry. He said, here I am. I've got a pot full of all the wisdom in the world, and my son, with nothing but his common sense, had a better idea than I did. And he was so mad that he took that pot and he threw it down on the ground. Well, what do you think happened? It broke. And so when it broke, all of those pieces of wisdom went flying out into the world. They were no longer all together in one big pot. They were all over the place. And Anansi's neighbors and friends started finding little bits of wisdom everywhere they went. And every time they found a piece of wisdom, they would pick it up and take it with them. And pretty soon, everybody had some of the wisdom, and nobody had all of it anymore. And every time that people would get together with someone else, they'd share their idea, and their neighbor might share their idea. And pretty soon, everybody had a little bit, and nobody had it all. And everyone had to share their ideas in order to learn what they needed to know. Does that sound more like how the world really is? Yeah, I think so too. So remember that you've got a little bit of wisdom. And everybody you meet has a little bit of wisdom. And if you put your heads together and think creatively, you'll have even more. Don't be like Anansi the spider. Okay?
She smiled, leapt without looking, and tumbled into the Seine. The water was freezing. She spent a month sneezing and said she would do it again. She captured a feeling, a sky with no ceiling, the sunset inside a frame. Here's to the ones who dream, foolish as they may seem. Here's to the hearts that ache. Here's to the mess we make. She told me a bit of madness is key to give us new colors to see. Who knows where it will lead us? And that's why they need us. So bring on the rebels, the ripples from pebbles, the painters and poets and plays. Here's to the fools who dream, crazy as they may seem. Here's to the hearts that break. Here's to the mess we make.
This morning's reading is a little longer than the readings I usually use. I hope you'll indulge me. It's a poem by Billy Collins, so it's very accessible. It's called Directions. You know the brick path in back of the house? The one you see from the kitchen window, the one that bends around the far end of the garden where all the yellow primroses are. And you know how if you leave the path and walk up into the woods, you come to a heap of rocks, probably pushed down during the horrors of the Ice Age, and a grove of tall hemlocks, dark green now against the light brown fallen leaves. And farther on, you know the small footbridge with the broken railing, and if you go beyond that, you arrive at the bottom of that Sheep's Head Hill. Well, if you start climbing, and you might have to grab hold of a sapling when the going gets steep, you will eventually come to a long stone ridge with a border of pine trees, which is as high as you can go and a good enough place to stop. The best time is late afternoon, when the sun strobes through the column of trees as you are hiking up. And then when you find an agreeable rock to sit on, you will be able to see the light pouring down into the woods and breaking into the shapes and tones of things. And you will hear nothing but a sprig of birdsong or the leafy falling of a cone or nut through the trees. And if this is your day, you might even spot a hare or feel the wing beats of geese driving overhead toward some destination. But it is hard to speak of these things. How the voices of light enter the body and begin to recite their stories. How the earth holds us painfully against its breast made of humus and brambles. How we, who will soon be gone, regard the entities that continue to return greener than ever, spring water flowing through a meadow and the shadows of clouds passing over the hills, and the ground where we stand in the tremble of thought, taking the vast outside into ourselves. Still, let me know before you set out. Come, knock on my door, and I will walk with you as far as the garden, with one hand on your shoulder. I will even watch after you and not turn back to the house until you disappear into the crowd of maple and ash, heading up toward the hill, piercing the ground with your stick. So I've been wrestling with questions about creativity. Why do we sometimes feel like we have lots of it, and other times feel like we don't have nearly as much as we need? Why do some people seem to be able to tap into it so easily while others struggle, and where on earth does it come from? Now, I realize your theme this month is grace, not creativity. But for me, creativity is a form of grace. Grace being that which comes to us freely, often from who knows where. We don't have to earn it. We receive it. It's up to us to try to notice it and appreciate it and be grateful for it. And creativity is like that too. The ideas, the inspiration just seem to appear from who knows where. Hard work sometimes seems to help it along, but other times it just hits out of nowhere. And as with other manifestations of grace, if we're not paying attention, we might miss it. Now, the idea of creativity is not just for self-defined creative types. So those of you who are artists of any kind, writers, musicians, painters, sculptors, all those kinds of things, you probably think in terms of creativity. But creativity is part of everybody's life. It can show up in day-to-day tasks like cooking and gardening. I've had to get creative. I'm having some tendonitis trouble in my hands. I've had to get creative in how I clean because certain things hurt. So I have to come up with new ways of doing things that don't hurt my hands. It's there in the ways we think about the world, we manage our relationships, we face our challenges. So while I, for example, might frame a conversation about creativity by exploring the process of writing a sermon, for example, for you it might be something very different, from planning a garden to designing a new process at your workplace, to thinking about what to do with your time once you're not at your workplace anymore, to rethinking a conflict in your family. We can access that grace of creative thought in everything we do. Now, so often the image of a creative type is held up as this solitary, inspired figure, working alone in their studio or at their desk or in the laboratory or under a tree somewhere, wherever their work or art takes them. And I know for me, I used to have this wonderful image, especially with poets. I always thought poets would just sit down under a tree and the words would just flow onto the page. Or the painter would just spread the paint and perfect things would emerge. Or the potter would shape the clay and it would do exactly what she wanted. New ideas bursting spontaneously into the mind, all that brilliance waiting within the artist just pouring forth effortlessly. Doesn't that sound lovely? It's never been my experience, you understand. But I certainly hope some of you have had some of those moments. Then there's the opposite image, that image of the tortured artist, sitting up in that cold, dark garret, struggling to pull forth each word and put it on the page. Now that's a completely different way of thinking about the process of creativity, but notice that it's still a completely solitary image. It's easy to buy into that way of thinking about creativity, to think that that's how we should find it. Go off by ourselves, go into ourselves, and creativity will emerge. Inspiration or grace will strike us. And sometimes that does happen. But often it's a little more complicated than that, a little more involved. And I got to thinking about this through an article by Joshua Wolf Schenck, who's done a lot of work on the social foundations of creativity, and especially the creative power of working in pairs. He had an opinion piece called The End of Genius, which was published in the New York Times in 2014, and now he's got a book out. And he got me thinking about what he calls the myth of the lone genius, this solitary idea as the primary model for creativity, thinking instead about a much more collaborative creative network. Now, most of us have had that experience where new ideas come into our head when we're interacting with somebody else, when we're having a conversation and one thought sparks another thought and something begins to build and something better begins to emerge, something more complex or nuanced than we would have come to by ourselves. So creativity may be much more grounded in our connectedness than most of the models would imply. But there are also downsides to that more collaborative approach. because many of us have also had the experience of being in that kind of conversation and having our own tender ideas squelched by someone who didn't honor them or find them helpful to the way the conversation was going. Or having the whole conversation turn in a direction that left us out altogether, so that our creativity ended up subsumed in someone else's vision. It takes courage to put our tender, fragile ideas out there where someone might judge them. I remember once serving a congregation that always had what they called the talkback after the service. And I know this congregation years ago always had a talkback too. Ministers hate talkbacks. And the reason is that we make ourselves really vulnerable up here. We put out these tender, fragile ideas that we've wrestled with and we're not quite sure of. And then we say, okay, what'd you think? Tear me to pieces, which is often how it would feel. So I remember once preaching a sermon that I had found very difficult to write. And before I started it, I said, there's not going to be a talkback today. Because writing this sermon was like giving birth, and no one in this room has the right to tell me that I had an ugly baby. I said, if you don't like this sermon, or if you do, you can talk to me next week when I am not quite so raw. So that collaborative approach, while it can be really helpful and inspiring and energizing, can also be intimidating or squelching, depending on how it goes. So I've been struggling. Is creativity best unleashed in solitude, as the old model suggests, or in community, as Schenk's work suggests? But that also got me then wondering about where that actual creativity itself comes from. Like, what is it? And here I want to pull in something else that Schenk said in his article, just to stir the pot a little. Because he also points out, and I quote, historically speaking, locating genius within individuals is a recent enterprise. So this idea of somebody being a genius, that genius is located in them, that they are a genius. He says that's a recent enterprise. Before the 16th century, one did not speak of people being geniuses, but having geniuses. Genius, explains the Harvard scholar Marjorie Garber, a genius was a tutelary god or spirit given to every person at birth. And any value that emerged from within a person depended on a potent, unseen force that came from beyond that person. So not something we have within us, but something that comes through us from some potent, unseen force. So does that creativity, those moments of grace when inspiration or wisdom strike, does that come from within us? Does it come from beyond us? And if it comes from beyond us, from those of us who think of ourselves as atheists or agnostics, what does that mean? I remember a conversation with a Unitarian colleague of mine many years ago now. I was still a student, and he was sort of a mentor of mine, and we were talking about the sermon writing process. Some of you may have heard me tell this story. He was describing his process of writing, how sometimes it would be really hard, and then other times the words would flow in such surprising ways. And he had this sense that the words were not coming from him, but through him. As if he said, as if they were coming from, well, God. Let's call a spade here. The gift of grace flowing through the author onto the page, that potent, unseen force working through the writer to create. So creativity, from within us, from beyond us, alone, in collaboration. How much of our creativity really comes from us and how much from those potent unseen forces? What do we understand those forces to be? How can we open up and allow ourselves to be more receptive to them? Where is the balance between working alone and working collaboratively? And what allows us to tap into that source of creativity in the first place? Many of you know me well enough to know that I won't be answering all those questions this morning. But for me, a lot of it comes down to balance. Neither one approach nor the other, but a gentle blending of both. For a long time, I totally bought into the lone genius model. I was absolutely sure, for example, that sermons should be written in silent solitude. Preferably, in fact, in the dead of night when solitude is even more silent. and it was really lonely. I remember this New Yorker cartoon that I cut out probably 30 years ago. It showed a simple line drawing of a wolf sitting on a hillside in the snow. The caption read, "Lone Wolf," and above the wolf's head there were these 4 little thought bubbles. The wolf was thinking, proud, independent, resourceful, cold. There's an expression about the creative process of writing that has been attributed to a number of different people over the years. I tried to track down the original source, and a Google search led me to about 8 different people, including sports writer Red Smith and author Gene Fowler. But whoever said it first, many people would agree who have tried to write creatively. Writing is easy. All you do is sit staring at the blank sheet of paper until the drops of blood form on your forehead. That is the most evocative description I know for that tortured lone genius model of writing. I've been there, and it is not a grace-filled experience most of the time. So over time, I've learned to break out of that lone model when I need to build some collaboration into the process, to share ideas, to read and watch and listen as grist for the creative mill. Articles, conversations, phone calls, Facebook posts, all of those can be potential sparks for the fire of creativity. After all, so much of what I have experienced of grace has come to me through other people. Why should I rule that out in the creative process? But too much of that external stimulation can become a distraction that then keeps me from going inward and doing the deep thinking that I need to do to make whatever it is I'm wrestling with my own. So at some point, I still have to go into that quiet, look inside and see what's trying to come out, to pay attention to those potent, unseen forces that might be speaking through me. Balance. And that's where the Billy Collins poem that I picked for this morning comes into it. Because he expresses so beautifully the things that allow us to tap into and trust those potent, unseen forces, however we understand them. I'm not sure it really matters whether those forces come from beyond us or within us. All of that is mysterious to me. As long as we can listen for them and be receptive to them and try to trust them, I don't think we'll ever pin down where they come from. In the poem, Collins describes the way that our experience of the natural world and its solitude can bring us to the deep places in ourselves, bring us back to our center. Listen again. But it is hard to speak of these things, how the voices of light enter the body and begin to recite their stories, how the earth holds us painfully against its breast made of humus and brambles, how we who will soon be gone regard the entities that continue to return greener than ever, spring water flowing through a meadow, and the shadow of clouds passing over the hills, and the ground where we stand in the tremble of thought, taking the vast outside into ourselves. Conversation and collaboration can be powerful creative tools. But if Billy Collins had had his phone with him and been checking his Facebook feed or texting his buddies, he would never have written that poem. Instead, he walked into the wilderness away from all the noise. He allowed the voices of light to enter the body and begin to recite their stories. He opened his heart so it could take the vast outside into itself. Sometimes we have to go into the quiet and feel our place within something larger, something beautiful and good, and know that we are part of it just as we should be. And that can help free us from some of the fear and anxiety of not being good enough, from our pressure to need to be perfect, which I think is a lot of what can block our creativity or our ability to recognize grace when we encounter it. Think about kids. They just create. It doesn't occur to them that it has to be perfect, or that they can't really draw, or dance, or sing. They just create out of the fullness of their being, and they trust that what they do is beautiful. They're in touch with grace. It's that fullness of being that we need to reconnect with in order to free our creative spirit. Because maybe sometimes creativity does come out of sadness or despair and loneliness and desperation. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention. After all, we may find creative solutions because we have no other choice, or we may be able to channel our despair into something that can become beautiful and life-giving. So that image of the emotionally tortured artist creating beauty out of suffering is old and powerful, and it has its share of truth. But I still believe that most of us do our best work when we're grounded in a sense of our own worth, of being a beautiful piece of something larger than we are. And that brings in one more level of balance that we need for creativity. Because I've said creativity requires a balance between enough contact and conversation to stimulate us and enough quiet to allow things to gestate and be born. But I think creativity also requires the right balance between true companionship and deep solitude that allows us to be grounded in our own worth. And I say true companionship with intention, because there are lots of different ways to interact and collaborate and get intellectual and creative stimulation, and many of them can be helpful. But we can surround ourselves with so much of that, with so many people and interactions and ideas. We can have so much input that we get overwhelmed and still not get the kind of accompaniment and companionship that actually feeds our souls, that provides a conduit for grace and the creative process. And that's why I love the final stanza of Billy Collins' poem. Because after he has poured out all of this beautiful imagery about going alone into nature, the journey of leaving the path and going up the hill and paying attention, having this profoundly solitary experience of feeling one's place in the natural world, then he doubles back to the beginning of the journey and he says, "Still, let me know before you set out. Come knock on my door, and I will walk with you as far as the garden, with one hand on your shoulder. I will even watch after you and not turn back to the house until you disappear into the crowd of maple and ash, heading up toward the hill, piercing the ground with your stick." That stanza still really chokes me up because my mom died just over a year ago, and that was so her model of mothering. She didn't hover, she didn't fuss, but you could almost still feel the hand on the shoulder when you set off on your own. And she never let us drive away from the house without being on the porch waving. So now my sister and I make sure that whenever one of us is leaving the other's home, the other is always out there waving. If you are lucky, you have known people who have walked with you as far as the garden with one hand on your shoulder and then watched after you and not turned back to the house until you had disappeared into wherever it was that you needed to go alone. That reassuring touch on the shoulder saying, "I love you and I am with you." The watching after saying, "I will continue to hold you in my heart." But the eventual turning back into the house, respecting the journey that you need to make alone. That is the balance that I suggest we need to allow grace and creativity to flow through us, to be able to experience them. And maybe that is the most important thing we're called to do for each other, to challenge and inspire each other's thinking, to affirm each other's essence, to share each other's journey, and to give each other space for the quiet places and the time alone. I think one of our most important tasks as individuals and as a community is to encourage and support the conditions that allow people to find that balance and then bring forth the best of who they are. because our world needs people who can bring forth the best of who they are and share it with love and without fear. So in our dance with grace and creativity, may we pay attention to the balance that allows us to seek them and experience them most fully. May we find moments of deep connection. May we seek out the people and the ideas that best stimulate our thinking and shake up new possibilities. And may we claim some of the quiet solitude that allows us to listen and wait for those potent, unseen forces to help us bring forth the best that we have within us. May it be so.